The government's approach to policy making can benefit from a greater injection of compassion and thoughtfulness. This was highlighted by MP for Sengkang GRC Jamus Lim in his maiden speech. And instead of the progressive wage model, where wages of low-income workers are pegged to productivity and skills, he suggested a singular minimum wage be introduced across all sectors. This prompted a 35-minute debate between Dr. Lim and MPs from the People's Action Party, including Senior Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam, who stressed that no one has a monopoly over compassion. Gwyneth Teo with more.
Today about compassionate.
Dr. Lim says government policies often lean toward resource efficiency rather than fairness and equity.
Inasmuch as we have indeed progressed over the past few decades, the gains from this progress have not been equally shared across society. It is therefore undeniable that our existing approach to policy making can benefit from a greater injection of compassion and thoughtfulness. We have a form of minimum wage policy via the progressive wage model. Yet, until recently, we had deemed it unwise to make it universal and still dress the policy with so many additional conditions that the incentives for upskilling turn into loopholes that employers use to retain workers on the lowest rung of wages. We warn against unaffordable costs and lost jobs, despite evidence that the majority of Singaporeans would be willing to pay more for essential services, and that the employment impact of a minimum wage is likely to be very limited.
I beg to differ. I think under current times, where businesses are being challenged and we're in a period of recession, there is a very real risk that if we were to introduce minimum wage, a universal minimum wage across all sectors, I think many of our lower wage workers may lose their jobs. And from low wage, they become no wage.
I would argue that we should be able to think about implementing policies like a minimum wage in a time of crisis, because this concentrates the mind. So there's no doubt that at this very moment, such a policy may not be ideal, but let us come together and agree that this is a principle that we want to roll out, so that when we set these plans in place, after the storm has passed, we can easily bring them to pass.
Senior Minister of State for Manpower Zaki Mohammed said compassion in policy making comes in other tangible forms, not just wages.
I think it's easy to talk about compassion when it's just mere talk, and when you've got to put money on the table, you've also got to consider as a government where that money comes from. When you talk about compassion, we've just put up 4 budgets in the space of 3 months. What does that mean, $100 billion? I think many Singaporeans have also felt the impact of the care and support package. Job support scheme, I think, is one of the best forms of unemployment insurance to some extent, where you can see many jobs being saved during this period. So the transfers that the government gives, it goes beyond just wages, but it encompasses the whole system, where I think a large part of our low-wage workers are given that shelter, that stability for their children to be able to grow up in stable homes, given the opportunities to rise.
Mr. Zaki also defended the progressive wage model, a policy that unions, government and employers have discussed since 2012. He explained that the differentiated approach to raising wages is because the needs of every sector are different. However, Dr. Lim said this over-engineering of policy exposes it to flaws.
As long as you have the possibility that another sector has a minimum wage that is different from the first, you run the risk that there is going to be substitution between one sector versus another. That's our entire point. You want to shut out this possibility of substituting between workers in one sector and another, such that employers end up gaming the system in that fashion.
Mr. Zaki and other members also quizzed Dr. Lim on specifics.
What is the level of minimum wage that the member proposes is appropriate for Singapore?
I do not know. And that is exactly why what we need is a national commission to understand this and to study this. And in fact, that panel should continue to exist year after year after that minimum wage policy is rolled out, because that will allow us to continually evaluate whether the level of the minimum wage is actually appropriate.
May I first confirm if it would be accurate for me to interpret that based on Mr. Lim's response to MOS Gan Xiao Huang, is that you do recognize that implementing minimum wage in a climate like this will have unintended adverse consequences on our economy and as well as our employment?
Personally, I do not necessarily think that rolling out the minimum wage is a good time, but I would not go the second step of saying that it would imply adverse consequences.
Dr. Lim's colleague Mr. Leon Pereira also joined the fray, seeking clarification from the political office holders who had spoken earlier. He asked Mr. Zaki whether there is room for improvement for the model in other sectors with low-wage workers.
Should this group wait until the progressive wage model comes to them? How long will that take? How many years will that take? Is there no room for improvement? My second point of clarification is to MOS Gan. If the minimum wage is not set too high, it will have a minimal or negligible impact on jobs. There is actually quite considerable academic evidence for this proposition. And I would like to ask MOS Gan, would she consider that actually the danger to jobs is not setting a minimum wage, but setting a minimum wage too high, which is definitely not what we are advocating.
Senior Minister and Coordinating Minister for Social Policies Tharman Shanmugaratnam intervened at this point, saying the government is not done with improving the lives of low-wage workers.
We do believe that it is important to raise the wages of our lowest paid workers. We really believe this. We've achieved significant progress in the last 10 years and in the last 5 years, and we think we should go further. I would not, and I say this to everyone from all sides, I would not exaggerate the differences between the PWM model and the minimum wage model. The PWM model is a minimum wage plus, and it is a sectoral approach. And the sectoral approach actually has a lot to commend it, because it allows you to set the minimum rung at a level that is not so low and not so high. Because if you have a single level, you'll have to decide where to pitch it. How to do it without having gaming is an issue that policymakers grapple with. Not such a complicated issue in practice, to be frank, and you have to watch what happens at the edges. But it's a very sensible approach. I would like to suggest that none of us have a monopoly over compassion. And I say this not to discredit anyone, but in particular, I really respect where Member Jamus Lim is coming from, intellectually, emotionally, and so on. But don't assume that, no one should assume that you have a monopoly over compassion. Many of the speeches that we've heard in the last few days were about how we can do more in a way that really helps those we're trying to help. But we are frankly not very far away from each other in that objective. In fact, we seem to be quite convinced. I mean, there is a consensus, let me put it that way, that should be our objective.